Hey everyone, Matthias here with another episode of Single Track. Let's start off this week's episode with a product review I am so very excited about. Over the last couple weeks, I've been testing the newest La Sportiva trail running shoes, the Carousel and the Cyclone. The Carousel sells for $130, the Cyclone for $160. Links to these shoes are, as always, in the show notes and on our gears page. La Sportiva provided me with these two pairs as review units, but as you know it, I love La Sportiva shoes, so I was very excited trying them out. Both shoes have an incredible rugged sole, which is something La Sportiva fans are used to, but if you usually wear other shoes, the traction and the incredible lugs will absolutely delight you. Both have good stack heights and similar drops of 8 millimeters for the Cyclone and 7 for the Carousel. For La Sportiva shoes, the Carousel feels super roomy in the toe box. And La Sportiva really positions this shoe for you to wear on long ultras. I'm excited about that one. The Cyclone is a complete modern vision of a trail running shoe with the BOA lacing system and the neoprene sock-like upper. Having worn them both for a few runs on trails, here are my initial impressions. And I'm sure you hear a lot more about these shoes as I'm honing down which shoe I'm going to be wearing for Monte Rosa. So, the Carousel. It feels like a regular trail runner, feels heavier, sturdier, but is actually lighter than the Cyclone. Not by much, but it surprised me when I compared the weight that the Carousel is actually lighter than the Cyclone. It feels like a shoe that protects your feet on technical terrain and one you can really push the miles in due to the roomy toe box. Like, I love wearing the Carousel out at Kaiser. It just feels like a shoe that will totally protect me out there. Knowing me and my experience with the Jackal that immediately tore my heel, I was super hesitant with the Carousel, but it never gave me any issues, and I'm sort of falling in love with that shoe. Mind you, I'm looking for a shoe I can wear for running my Monte Rosa 100K in, and as I'm looking for a shoe that can really go the distance. I'll be traveling light and won't be able to change shoes mid-race, so I need the one shoe that can carry me for 100K. Why I'm not taking the North Face ones, you ask? While that shoe worked well at Lumberjack, the sole felt too slippery once it started raining, and the rocker didn't give me the support I was looking for on technical terrain. So, I'm going back to La Sportiva. I need to find a shoe that won't let me down on long ultras. On a bigger picture, here are my thoughts on how La Sportiva positions the trail running shoes. The company has been making mountaineering boots and rock climbing shoes for decades. You find their boots on Mount Everest and on El Capitan. That's La Sportiva's legacy, and no other shoe company can come even close to claiming that position. Now, the fully insulated mountaineering boots on one side of the spectrum and the small, narrow, slick rock climbing shoes on the other side. In between are a whole lineup of shoes that start on each far end and sort of make themselves to the centers. And at the center are the trail running shoes. So as the mountaineering boot gets lighter, it loses the insulation, it loses the Gore-Tex layer, becomes a light hiking shoe, and eventually becomes a trail running shoe. And I think the Carousel positions themselves on that spectrum. It feels like it could be a really great light hiking shoe, but it is a running shoe. And then the Cyclone, I think their approach from the other end. So you've got these super slick, light rock climbing shoes, the ones that sort of like wrap themselves around your feet. And as you're going up to the shoes getting more sole and more grip and becoming actually walkable in, they becoming light trail runners in the way the Cyclone is. The Cyclone feels like a shoe that you wouldn't need socks in. I probably would still use them. But that neoprene sock that is a little bit of a pain to kind of put your feet in when you first put those shoes on feels really, really good when you wear it on a run. And that BOA lacing system just sort of like hugs your foot in a way no other lacing system I've has ever felt around my foot. So I really loved the Cyclone when I first put it on. But I'm a little bit worried that this BOA system isn't sturdy enough. I talked to a friend of mine who's worn that Cyclone with BOA, and he said on his run, that BOA system immediately popped off, catching on a rock or root or something. He was able to reassemble it, but if that happens mid-run, then you're sort of screwed. So, Carousel or Cyclone. Cyclone is more expensive. It's $160. Feels absolutely incredible. I would totally wear the Cyclone on a shorter race. And I'm still really want to try out and see how the Cyclone holds up on a few longer runs. It does feel like the sole lets through a little bit more sharp underground rocks and roots and stuff. So you do get a little bit more fatigue on your feet. But overall, that shoe feels absolutely incredible. And it feels sort of like the future of trail running, right? So if you're a rock climber and you want to go trail running, that feels like the shoe you're going to wear. If you are a hiker and you want a sturdy shoe that feels like it needs to protect your feet on long runs, then the Carousel is perfect, especially with the wider toe box. So these are my first impressions. Carousel for La Sportiva shoes, wide toe box, super sturdy material to protect your feet. And the Cyclone, a shoe that makes your foot feel amazing, but is definitely more on the futuristic light side. So the question is, can it hold up in every terrain? And can that BOA system stand the time? So, two shoes I absolutely love, had no issues with at all. One shoe I want to love more because the Cyclone is futuristic and amazing. The other shoe actually coming through as being the more dependable shoe. I will do a lot more testing with these two pair, the La Sportiva Carousel and the La Sportiva Cyclone, over the next couple weeks before I make a decision on which shoe I'm going to take with me to Europe to run Ultra Trail Monte Rosa. And now, here is Single Track with special guest Alex Bond. Alex Bond has been previously on a show talking about fastest known times and how you set an FKT. He helps the fastest known time folks at fastestknowntime.com figure out which FKTs fit here in the Pacific Northwest region, coordinate with people. He does some really great work. He himself is obviously an ultra runner and loves into orienteering races and a whole bunch more. So thanks, Alex, for coming back on the show. Let's go. Alex, welcome back to Single Track. It's good to have you back.
Hey, good to talk to you again.
So, with Doug being out, I needed another voice. I needed a co-host. Thanks for jumping in. How has the summer been for you?
I'm happy to have the opportunity to chat with you again. Yeah, it's actually been a pretty good one. We've had this wonderful sun for the past, I can't even count at this point how many weeks here in the Pacific Northwest. And, of course, that makes the fire areas all dry and ready to go up into flames. But it's made for lots of opportunities to go out every weekend. And, you haven't had to really worry that much about, I'm going to get rained out, or where is the weather good and where is the weather bad. It seems like people have been able to do just about whatever they want, just about every weekend. And I've been trying to take advantage of that. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Last weekend I did the Loowit Trail around Mount St. Helens, which was a lot of fun.
That's right. We need to talk about this. I have this on my radar as well, and you did it, but you had sort of mixed impressions. Loowit Trail is the circumnavigation of Mount St. Helens, very popular running route, close to 40 miles?
It depends a little bit on how because there's the loop around the mountain itself, which is about 28 miles, and then you have to get to that loop from a trailhead. And so I think the most direct way, which I did, is about 4 miles round trip to get to the trail. It's like 2 miles to the loop. You run 28-mile loop, 2 miles back to the trailhead. So I think I ended up covering about 32 miles.
Okay, 50K, yeah.
And then in terms of elevation gain, my watch came back with something like 8,000 feet, which I think is incorrect. Most people seem to say it's around 6, but it's a hard 6. It's a lot of sand for a ton of the route. And so it's one of those ones where you sort of look, the stats aren't really that out of this world, 50 kilometers with 6,000 feet of climbing, but they're hard miles. It's also, besides just people going out and doing the loop, which, that weekend when I was out there were probably, there were a lot of other people doing the loop, but they also do a lot of races there. Mm-hmm. There's the Volcanic 50K, which does just the loop, and then the Destination Trails, who organizes the 200 milers with Candace. They both have the Bigfoot one that includes some of the Loowit, and then they also were doing that same day that I was out there, where they were doing a 40 and 73 mile race that includes some of the Loowit. And so in addition to I had seen that, and I didn't want to be kind of banditing the race, and so I went the opposite direction that they were. I went counterclockwise instead of clockwise, and so it felt a little bit more independent, but there were all those people doing the race, and then probably another maybe 8 people or so who looked like they were doing it in a day like I was. And so it was quite popular and quite crowded out there, frankly.
Yeah, it is. I think it's a popular circumnavigation, partially because it feels on paper to be something that seems more reasonable. Now, you talked about the sand and the exposure. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's on the northern part during the through the blast zone, if I'm correct, right?
Well, that was kind of what I thought, but it's actually a lot more than just this one section. I had sort of gone into it with the expectation. I maybe hadn't done enough research on the route or something, but I had gone into it with the expectation that about that northern third there, where it's really, really blasted out, that would be the part that would be exposed and the sort of sandiest and the roughest terrain. It actually ended up being a whole bunch. There was very little tree cover anywhere on the route, and a whole lot of it was just that kind of sand and gravel kind of stuff, which and then it was like when I was towards the end and I was tired, and it was just like, geez, I just wanted to find some shade here. Yeah. And it was very different terrain than we're used to here in Washington State, because even when you think about Eastern Washington and you think about going for a run in the Tiena Way or around sort of Mazama or Winthrop, they have, even where it's that drier terrain, that drier climate, they still have a lot of the sort of ponderosa pine forests and stuff like that. And that just this totally exposed landscape just there's not a ton of places. I guess maybe the Yakima Canyon, where the Yakima Skyline race is sort of like that, but it was really kind of unique. And maybe it was just sort of me being a Washington boy coming through, but I was like, I actually kind of like having trees around, it turns out.
It's interesting that you say that, because I think I didn't experience it at the Grand Canyon, because the canyon is so deep that even though it's hot and exposed, you can find shade behind the canyon walls, right? The sun dips down fairly quickly below, and those canyon walls throw shade. But when I ran Zion, I felt that way in the afternoon, that I came to a couple water and aid stations, and I was like, I needed that relief, or was longing for that relief to find some shade, and there was absolutely nothing. You were just baking in the heat. Yeah, you could perhaps sit or refill your water or so, but there was absolutely no relief. So I hear you, how we take this for granted. Mm-hmm. Here in Western Washington, and when you then don't have it, you realize how valuable it is, especially in the last third of your run, when you're sort of longing to find a place to sit down or so, or to rest a little bit. How were the water sources on that trail?
There were a couple. There was actually a decent amount of water in the blast zone. There was little creeks coming down out of the mouth of the crater. And then there's the South Fork of the Toutle, which is a ton of water there. It's not huge, but it's a ton of water there. There were a lot of other dry sections, and I think I had a 2-liter reservoir, and then I had 2 little sort of bottles up front. And I didn't have the 2-liter reservoir filled all the way up most of the time, but that at least having that capacity to go up to around 3 liters, I actually kind of appreciated. And that's one where, especially for somebody like me who doesn't love the heat and doesn't maybe love that sun exposure, you really got to have a lot of water capacity, and you got to fill up when you can.
Yeah. And do you filter your water?
I did, because, I'm not exactly going for a fastest known time or something like that, because it's, when you're doing that sort of 12-hour kind of effort, it's kind of nice to sit down for a little bit anyways, and it's a chance to sit down and eat some heavier food and digest it. And, and so if you want to sit down for 10 minutes at, 3 points in the race, if your plan is, okay, at like 3 points, I'm going to take this sort of, 10, 15 minute break, then you might as well filter your water too while you're at it. I think there are probably places where you could, also, a lot of the water there is very silty, because it's coming down through that sand, and so it's carried, and so you would probably want to filter it anyways. I've heard a lot of people go back and forth about you don't need to filter in some of these places, or you do need to filter. I think you probably actually don't a lot of the time, but it's one of those better safe than sorry kind of things that I don't mind doing it.
Yeah, no, I hear you. So what brought you to want to do that loop? Was that big bucket list item? I hate that term. Was that something talk to me about it. What made you want to do it?
Well, I actually hadn't run an ultra marathon since 2018. In 2019, I was focused a lot more on rock climbing, and I was spending more time doing that. And I was involved in the Mountaineers Intermediate Climbing course and spending a lot of time with that. And so I wasn't really in fantastic running shape then, and I didn't end up doing any ultras in 2019. And then in 2020, I had big plans that, of course, were completely ruined. And I didn't really end up I did some sort of 20-mile kind of stuff, but I hadn't actually done 31 miles since I can't even remember exactly when in 2018. And so I was sort of feeling like I want to get one of my big goals for this year. And I didn't actually have that many goals for this year. I wanted to be a bit more just sort of take it on as it comes. But I wanted to get back into sort of better running shape like I had been previously, and commit back into doing some of these longer adventure runs that I hadn't for a couple of years. And so I knew I really want to do some 50Ks this summer out, unsupported, self-supported kind of a thing. And, I think the Loowit Trail is a really appealing one for a couple of reasons. I think it's one that it doesn't have the off-the-charts elevation gain stats. So if you're worried about what kind of shape am I in, I think it is an attainable and doable one. It's one that, you mentioned I don't love the bucket list term either, but it is there's a certain logic and appeal to just sort of the idea of doing the circumnavigation that is just really cool. And it is this, whether or not it should be iconic, it kind of is iconic. It's one of the trails that almost everybody knows the name of, almost everybody does at some point. And so I thought it was very appealing. I had originally planned to do it a couple weeks earlier, and then the heat wave said, with all the sun exposure on it, it would have been a very, very, very poor decision to try to do it during the heat wave, I think. And then when that was over, I was sort of looking at what are my options, what can I do, and then I thought, this is something that I should do. It makes a lot of sense, and I am glad I did it. I didn't love all of the terrain, but it was a very unique place. There was this it was a place that I think makes sense to have been and to see and to experience. And then you sort of say, oh, you know what? Turns out I like Mount Rainier or the Olympics or the North Cascades more. Like, that's sort of the takeaway I came away from it with. But I'm still glad that I did it and experienced it. And it's cool to have finally gotten that monkey off my back and I've gotten back. I can officially call myself an ultra marathoner again now, I guess, since I can do it again now.
For sure. Congrats on that. That's awesome. But I want to circle back to the uniqueness of the circumnavigations, because I think there is something really special about this. And I feel like we as a trail running community, we should fight a little bit harder in trying to piece running routes or hiking trails together to make more loops, because it's so much more iconic to run a loop as opposed to just an out and back. I know running out to the Enchanted Valley and back is really cool too, but you sort of end up doing an out and back. And, there's something to be said about, especially when it comes to easier decision making, to be able to sort of know what you're going to expect on the second half probably makes it a little bit easier in your planning and approaching, especially if you're going solo or going with a group that has never done it before. But doing a loop like that gives you, I think, a deeper level of satisfaction than if you just do an out and back.
I totally agree. And ultimately, like, we do these things because we are excited about them, and people are going to run what has them psyched. And, I think the case where the out and back is cool is, if you're going to go summit a mountain or something like that, you go up the mountain and then you come back down, and that's often an out and back kind of thing.
Right.
You just see these loops on a map and they look cool. And, I think that that's ultimately what appeals to me a lot of the times, is you just see it on the map. You're like, that looks cool. I want to do that. And I think the circumnavigations have a huge appeal. And I think that, whether that's big, scary, hairy ones, or, like one of the super classic trail runs here in the Seattle area is running around Granite Mountain, which is, there's part of it that's on a road, so you can do the car shuttle, and then it's 12 miles, or you can run the road and it's 16 miles. That's super doable, and it's really scenic and really nice, and it's the kind of thing that you can, do early on Saturday morning and be back for, you'd be back in time for brunch kind of a thing. And it's super popular for good reason, because it's a cool and logical loop in a cool place. And I think that has just so much appeal to so many people. I think what's interesting is now, we've got these sort of classic loops like the Loowit, like the Timberline Trail around Hood, like the Wonderland around Rainier. And now it's over the past couple of years, people have started trying to explore, like, well, how would I actually go around Mount Baker, which turns out to be extremely complicated. There are people who have done loops around, you can put together an entirely on-trail loop around Glacier Peak, and it's been done in a single push. I know Luke Distelhorse and somebody else did it and I think it took them around 25 or 26 hours or something like that, but that's off the top of my head. That number could be wrong, but it doesn't have anything like the traffic or the appeal that the Wonderland does. And I think it'll be really cool to see how does that sort of continue to develop.
Yeah. No, for sure. I think, and I think Adams is theoretically possible, but meaning there is trail to do it, but you're going through private and or reservation land that is not open, or you need a special permit, or so it is possible. I think the other interesting thing, what I find fascinating and funny with this circumnavigation is taking these volcanoes. They on the map look like they're standing on their own, so the circumnavigation should be reasonably easy, you think, but then you realize that these mountains actually have all these valleys and hills that you constantly have to climb up and down to actually get around it, and that's where your vertical comes in. Mm-hmm. So even though you're not, as you're going around, climbing actually any peaks, you're still getting a ton of which is something that sometimes the things that people miscalculate as they're looking at this.
Yeah, and I think it is, especially with sort of those big rivers coming off the glaciers. It's just like valley after valley after valley. It's really interesting terrain. I think a fascinating route that somebody could try to assemble. You'd have to spend a lot of time looking at a map to figure it out. But what would a loop around Mount Olympus look like? You could sort of take the Hoh River Trail in for the north side, and then I guess maybe if you could connect somehow with the Bailey Range Traverse for the east side. But then what does your sort of south and west look like? That would be some extremely wild terrain, and whoever does that would have a very big adventure, I think.
I mean, that's sort of the challenge in the Olympics that I've discovered very, very quickly early on, that there are a few mountains that are very obvious to climb, have hiking trails up, and beyond that it gets gnarly very quickly. Trying to find, right? There's the one obvious trail that goes up to mountain, but as soon as you step off that trail, it gets wild. And so that's one of the big challenges we have in the Olympics. It was funny with my Cushman 6 route, because we did it so late last year. I didn't get a lot of response from it. It's not like that I want people to pat me on the back or anything, but just in general interest in the route. And then this year, as sort of the snow has melted and people start venturing out, a lot of people have been trying to find that connector trail between Eleanor and Rose. And friend of mine on Strava just attempted it, and he went solo, and he turned around because of the sketchiness of the terrain. And so I need to go out there soon. I was going to go a couple of weeks ago, but then we had different plans. But we need to go out there again to see if trees fell and it becomes now super sketchy, or if some of the ropes that were in last summer haven't been put back up or eroded or something. I'm curious what the condition is like, because I think that connector creates sort of an interesting loop, even though it does include then the road between the Rose and Eleanor or Big Creek Trailhead. You at least get a little bit more than just going up Eleanor and back down, going up Rose and back down, right?
And I think that's a great example of how maps and GPX tracks are not always connected to the reality on the ground, where there are trails that exist in reality that are not on any map, and there are things that are on the map that are not in reality anymore. And that, I think it just sort of shows how that kind of local knowledge is super important, because, I would bet that there are very, very few people in the world who are more familiar with Mount Rose than you are, and that kind of local knowledge is what makes this kind of thing possible,
I think the group that maintains these trails up there, they get first dibs on knowing what's going on. Now that Mount Rose trail crew that maintains Mount Rose Trail, and then they've been doing last summer some extensive work on the Eleanor Trail on the upper section, where because of Eleanor being so popular in the upper section, there were some sort of sketchy not really exposed, but there is a lot of loose surface where you could sort of slip and slide down a hillside for a couple 100 feet or so. I mean, you probably wouldn't die, but it wouldn't be very pleasant. And because of the popularity of the mountain, I think it's good that they clean up the trail and make it a little bit safer, if you will. I'm all for it, but I just saw that, I think last summer or so when I went up there, the Mount Rose Trail crew had their equipment up there, and they were carving steps into the hillside, which I appreciated. Mm-hmm. So, speaking of finding routes, one of the topics off mic we discussed talking about it is a segment of the trail running world that is explicitly off trail, if you will, that doesn't come with a predefined route, and that is orienteering. I know very little about it other than, in fact, I got introduced to it indirectly through following Gary Robinson's preparation to attempt the Barkley, and he joined a couple orienteering groups in doing events, races. So you did one earlier this week, and you have a story to tell. Tell me a little bit about what is orienteering, and what did it look like when you actually did it?
Yeah, orienteering is just running on trails or in terrain where you're navigating with a map and potentially a compass instead of having trail markers, or instead of having a GPX line to follow or something like that. And so there are a couple different formats that they'll do it with, but usually they'll have this sort of series of points that are marked on the map, and then you have to figure out your route in between them. And so there are a lot of orienteering clubs around the U.S. Cascade Orienteering Club is the one here in Washington State, and they organize a lot of events. They're very active. I'm sort of a member, but I'm not super active with them. I only just run some of their events, but they've got a very active sort of leadership team, and they do a lot of events with like kids getting, high school and cross country teams to do their events and stuff like that. It's a very robust group, and they do a lot of events, and it's something that I really encourage folks to check out, because it is it's a very, very different experience. And, the sort of idea of navigating with map and compass to these points, I think how a lot of people relate to it is, like you said, through the Barkley, and that, the Barkley is not strictly an orienteering event, because they still, they have a route that they want you to take between the books, whereas with orienteering, it's completely choose your own route. But that sort of idea of having to navigate potentially off trail, is sort of a through line between them. And, of course, a lot of the events, all the events here are generally easier than the Barkley by quite a significant margin. But it really is set up in a way where, people walk these events often. People, like I said, they have, young folks who are on middle school or high school cross country teams doing them. It really is accessible for just about anybody. And that, at least with Cascade Orienteering Club, they usually have several different difficulties, so that you can do one that's entirely on trail and you're just having to decide, okay, I'm at this trail intersection. Do I take a right or a left? Up to higher difficulties where you are doing mandatory off-trail travel and potentially having to navigate with a compass, like, okay, I want to go on a 170-degree bearing from here, off trail, and then I'll find a boulder and the control point will be there, or something like that. They really have those like different levels of difficulty so that you can find what's right for you and do something that you're comfortable with. What's really different about it is the mental demands while you are running. Because when you're on a normal run, you can kind of turn your brain off to some degree. You just sort of, I'm just running along, and you can listen to music or a podcast. You can have conversations in your head. You can just kind of zone out. Or, if you're on something where you're sort of focused, you're thinking about, when am I going too fast or too slow? When was the last time I ate? Do I need to eat more food, or is, what hurts, what feels good? Whereas when you are having to make these navigation decisions constantly, that takes up so much of your brain that it really forces you to be on at all times, and you can't relax or you'll get lost, and then you're in trouble, and you've got to figure out where you are, and you lose a bunch of time. So it makes for a much more intense, even if it's not physically necessarily more intense than a normal run, it makes for a mentally far more intense experience, which is really a different thing than most runs do, and that's part of the fun, I think.
I mean, this sounds very appealing, just as a next level challenge. And as somebody who, and I repeat myself here, but doesn't come from this collegiate running, because I do know a lot of people who are cross-country runners who are going into trail running, and they almost are annoyed with the the need for decision making. They want to go out on a run, and they want to know exactly what to expect, so they can get the exact amount of miles in the exact amount of time in, so they can be back home and can upload to Strava, right? But then the adventure part requires you to make some decision on the fly and figure things out, which, obviously it slows you down. It makes you stop at times, but it does sound appealing. So practically, when you go to an event like that, how much pre-work do you do? I mean, do you know the location, the general location where the event is at? Therefore, you can look at a map. But how much is work on the fly?
For most of the Cascade Orienteering Club events, because they're kind of lower key, it's usually just show up and do it on the fly. I've been doing these now for about 3 years or so, and they reuse a lot of locations. So actually, there are some of these I go back to, and I'm like, oh yeah, I've been here before. I kind of know at least the broad scope of where some of the major landmarks are and that kind of stuff. I've never done any of the really high-level events, but that my understanding is that things like the National or World Orienteering Championships, they'll actually say you cannot, they'll have a defined area where the course is going to be, and they'll say anybody who we catch on the course before the event is disqualified, so that you can't scout it out, and that there is that everybody is going in with a level playing field of seeing it for, not having scouted it out, that kind of a thing is my understanding of how they do it, which is kind of an interesting hook. I think if somebody really wanted to have a mastery of it, there are like you could look at Caltopo or whatever, where at the area, or at sort of sample maps or that kind of thing. But part of the fun is just kind of doing it, and they're low key casual events. And so part of the fun is just showing up and running.
I mean, I've never used a compass before, right? I mean, it is interesting that in a day and age of electronic devices, to think of going back to basics, if you will, and acquiring this skill. Sounds fascinating.
Well, and I'll also say it really does increase your confidence level when you are out on sort of an adventure, because on a real trail run or something like that, most of the time the navigation is actually not that complicated. If you're doing the Loowit Trail around St. Helens, it's like, okay, well, the mountain is right there, and I want to keep it on my left-hand side, and I'm going to just run this trail, kind of a thing. And then every so often you get to an intersection and you have to decide, do I go right or left? But it's not really that complicated. And that, some are a little bit more so, but, compared to the level of navigation precision that you need for orienteering, actual trail running is simple. And so that if you can do these orienteering events and you're able to practice in a no consequence environment, having to make navigation decisions, getting lost and getting yourself found, and doing it, in the course of a 1 hour event, the race I did this week, I think my finishing time was just over an hour, maybe an hour, 5 minutes or something like that. And I got lost and I had to practice getting lost and finding myself, I don't know, 3 or 4 times or something like that. And, so you get really good at finding yourself and figuring out where I am and what do I need to do next and that kind of a thing. And so that then when you are actually out on an adventure or something, it's no big deal because you've done this a million times before and you feel really confident and you've got the skills to back that confidence up with like actually getting it done and keeping yourself found. So I think that there is also a skills component that is valuable for somebody who does want to do backcountry adventures, to be a stronger navigator yourself and not having to rely on the GPX track on the phone. And to get this good practice at it.
So explain to me this a little bit more, and we'll have, for people interested in that, we'll have some links in the show notes. You sent me a link to a city park. I mean, this is just in Shoreline in Seattle, and you covered, your moving time was just over an hour, and you did cover 5 miles. So you were moving quite quickly, considering that you were also trying to figure out where you were going. How do you get yourself lost in a city park? Try to explain to me the practical ways. Like I can imagine being in a city park with no markings, right? I mean, I know LBA and everybody gets lost at LBA, but explain to me a little bit more what it feels like with your feet on the ground.
It's how could somebody get lost in this park? Oh, I managed to find a way to get myself lost. There are people who are better navigators than me who probably are maybe a little bit stronger, but that's part of why this is good practice. I think, most of the Cascade Orienteering Club events are at pretty calm locations. There's one coming up in a couple weeks at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle. So there you are, like, there are like giant roads, right nearby. I mean, you could, if you decided you were done, could walk for 2 minutes and you would be on pavement, kind of a thing, and, a lot of it is having to make really, really micro navigation decisions. And so maybe I know generally where I am, but, I'm going through this college campus, and there's a bunch of buildings, and I'm looking for one very specific building, and they all kind of look the same, and where exactly am I on this very micro level? I think that how you get lost is just sort of the precision of it, where you have to be super precise, and that and then also a lot of these you are trying to follow trails, and there are a lot of these parks have sort of social trails that maybe aren't on a map. And so you're saying, I'm going to run down this particular trail, and then I'm going to take the first right I see. Mm-hmm. I look at the map and I sort of see, okay, I want to go down this and then take the right. Well, now in reality, I'm running down this trail and I see some sort of little path where a few people have walked off to the right, and I've got to decide, is that the actual trail I have here on my map, or is that just some random people who walked off to the side of the trail and it's not what I should follow? And so that's one of the challenges, is sort of having to calibrate between what it shows on the map and what your eyes see as to, what are the actual trails that I need to be following? What are the landmarks I need to look out for? And so but that's all just part of the mental challenge. Mm-hmm. It's sort of the brain training that you need to do to make it work. And that's part of what makes it interesting.
No, for sure. I mean, it sounds really fascinating. I mean, I enjoy getting to know parks. I mean, I ran through the LBA woods for weeks and trying to figure out every single trail, and came up with a route in 2019 for a race. And now I rerouted a whole section of the course because I wanted to make it more interesting. But these trails are not new that I'm using. So they existed 2019. I never really considered including them back then. So I totally I'm fascinated by this and understand how quickly it is to get lost when you're not constantly paying attention, and how that is then physically demanding too. You sort of constantly have to start back up, slow back down, backtrack and stuff. So that's an interesting thing, but you're doing it as training to gain confidence. It's a sort of mental training, if you will, not so much mental as in intellectual training, if you will, in actually acquiring a skill to get comfortable when you then actually do head out into the mountains.
And it's also just fun. Sure. That's part of it too. But there are also for people who do get into it, there are larger events. The Cascade Orienteering Club ones are generally between these Wednesday night runs that they put on are generally, at least for me, around an hour. For some people they're faster, some people are slower. And then they've got a few that are longer, that are more in sort of the 3 or 4 hour range. And then there are also, there's this group it's like Northwest Nav races or Mare Geo, and they put on a really interesting series of races that are like, some of them are like there are 100 different points out in this area, and you have 6 hours to tag as many of them as you can. And so then you just go out. It's just like go out and find the points and come back. That's sort of a format. And then so I've done one 6-hour event, and then they also have 12 and 24-hour events. And so, there you've got to be really concerned about night. You've got to be concerned so much more about food and all those other factors that don't really matter. Over a 1-hour run, you don't have to worry too much about eating or fueling. But when I did the 6-hour run, that was one of the big challenges, was having the mental space to both make these short-term decisions about, do I take a right or a left? And then also having the mental space to make that long-term decision about how long has it been since I last ate. Because thinking about that mental intensity of having to constantly be on and constantly navigating, and then all of a sudden you look down at your watch and you're like, oh wow, it's been 90 minutes since I ate anything. I'm going to bonk real soon. And, over 6 hours, that is a little bit of a problem. Over 12 or 24 hours, that's a big problem. And so I think for 12 and 24 hours, they require people to be on teams of 2 or 3, which sort of adds a bit more of a margin where maybe somebody can, you can have somebody be point person on navigation and carrying that mental burden, and somebody else is more just following, and then you trade back and forth. But it makes for really, really complex events and really, really challenging. And, there are some times where I think, oh man, I should really get into this and try to do one of the, 12 or 24-hour events. And then there are some times where I'm like, man, that sounds super hard. I don't know if I'm really up for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've always said that as much as I'm fascinated with the Barkley to follow from afar, I don't care about running it at all. There's nothing that makes me want to ever consider running the Barkley. But I would consider doing that PTL at the UTMB, which is that 300-kilometer race that you do in a team, and you are sort of charting your own route. You have a beginning and an end point, but in between, and some checkpoints, but in between you're sort of deciding where and how you go. And there you've got, I believe, full GPS and stuff. So it's not meant to be an orienteering event, but it's definitely meant to be an event that you do as a team, and you're relying more on your own skills to get along, as opposed to trail markers every few feet, right? Mm-hmm. Is that something for you? Would you do the Barkley? Is it, aside from the physical training that would take, but that kind of event, that kind of style of event?
I think what interests me about trying to do something that is big and wild like that, I think it's very fascinating to be out in big terrain doing big things. I don't necessarily have the fitness that some people do, but I also wonder about, at least here in the United States, all of the best terrain is in wilderness areas, pretty much, where you can't have a race. And so I would kind of prefer to do my own thing in a wilderness area where nobody could ever organize a real race. And so that's sort of, I have a ton of respect for, obviously, people who attempt the Barkley. I am not inspired by that terrain. I think Europe is kind of a different thing, because I don't even know exactly how land permissions work over there, because they manage to have races in these incredible places. And I don't know how that all works, and do they have the equivalent of wilderness designation? It seems like they have no wilderness, and they just do whatever they want, wherever they want, and it all seems to work out. So the idea of trying to do something like one of those big European races seems super cool. But Europe also just seems so far away that I don't even know exactly how to approach that kind of a thing. But they certainly seem like very, very cool places to be.
Thank you for saying that the Barkley terrain doesn't inspire you, because I feel like I say that every time, and I feel a little bit bad because some people absolutely love it and they feel like I'm bad mouthing Tennessee. But yeah, I'm the same way. I'm like, just to go over there and then punish myself in this shrubbery and weird woods is not really fun, especially when I'm here in the Pacific Northwest and have the Capitol Forest outside. If I want to punish myself, I can just go off trail in the Capitol Forest for a couple hours.
I just see those pictures of people's legs all scratched up, and it's like, I don't, there's a time and a place for like making yourself hurt on a run, where it can be fun to be tired. I just don't understand like the appeal in getting my legs that scratched up from going through blackberry bushes or whatever. It's like, I don't know if that's for me.
The infamous briars. No, it's true. It's absolutely true. I mean, to answer your question very briefly about the European races, what they don't have is the Wilderness Act. They have national parks, and they have national protected land, but they don't have the Wilderness Act. It's the Wilderness Act from the 1960s that protects these lands, and part of the protection is this designation of no commercial enterprise and no groups of larger than 12. And I mean, there are a few other sort of pieces that were put in. No machinery, like you can't even put a bike in because it's considered machinery. So wording that was written in a way to protect a commercial exploitation and machinery like cars and other things. And I think we never revisited this, and as a result. And we're too afraid to revisit it, because if you feel like we opened the door for a commercial enterprise to hold an event, well, then we could also give a commercial oil lease out or something like that, right? I mean, I feel like there's sort of a slippery slope argument that is being made, and because all these federal lands are well managed federally, this stuff has to go through the highest doors. And I think in the Alps, these places are managed more with local municipalities, and there is an interest of the actual local tourist regions that sort of manage these areas anyway to bring people in order to encourage tourism. And so I think it flows from that piece. At least from what I know, it will be interesting to see what it feels like on the ground when I'm going over there in August.
Yeah, well, and I think there is my understanding, and I'm not an expert in how to direct a race in Europe, but my understanding from things like cycling events where, the Tour de France is happening right now, and that, local municipalities and areas will actually pay the Tour de France to come to their area because they know how many tourists come along with that. And that here in the US, the relationship is so different, where often the race has to, instead of the race getting paid by the local area, the race has to pay the local area for a permit. My understanding is that, like, heard a story from somebody who was putting on a bike race in California, and they were trying to, and there was like a European group who was interested in buying their bike race. And so they were like going through the numbers together of how the finances of the race work. And they were saying like, well, I don't see here in your numbers, how much do the local towns pay you to have the race in their area? And it's like, oh, no. That's actually on the expense side of that. It's not the income. That's on the expense side. And so I think maybe, we also have seen there are some places where like Emporia, Kansas with the Unbound gravel bike race, or Leadville with the run and bike race there, where towns recognize the economic impact from holding these races and are big boosters of those races. But that it just sort of seems like in general, there's a different relationship between local governments and races. I mean, obviously I'm sure there are some places where permitting agencies and race directors get along fantastic here in the U.S., but it just seems a little bit different than the Europeans.
Well, I mean, I think they get along fantastic as long as race directors are willing to pay, right? Mm-hmm. I know that the Capitol Forest doesn't officially charge. They are asking for a donation, so they don't have an official system set up. So some areas definitely are different. I know that on federal lands, there isn't just a permit fee. They are actually requiring you to submit an income report within, I think, 15 or 30 days after your race, and you pay a percentage off of your income. So if you get a permit to run through national forest land, thinking PCT or some of these areas, then part of your permitting process is actually percent of sales goes to the agencies, which is which is crazy on one side. On the other side, this is a fascinating conversation. And one of my favorite ones, in a sense, is that we often talk about these gateway communities to these unique locations, but they are, as much as they are benefiting from the national parks, they're so far away from them that it becomes a challenge. Think of Ashford outside of Mount Rainier. Clearly, there are plenty of little restaurants and hotels and campgrounds and stuff that wouldn't exist if Mount Rainier wouldn't be right next to it. But the amount of traffic that comes through of people that just driving through, because really stopping in Ashford isn't the national park. You don't even see the mountain from down there, right? It creates one of those weird double-edged swords, right? I mean, Yosemite, what city or town outside of Yosemite that is worthwhile stopping, that you mentally connected to be part of Yosemite, right? There's no city that would come to mind, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a weird challenge, and I don't know if the national parks are too big here or what it is, to kind of create that symbiotic relationship between the towns truly wanting tourists. The UTMB starts and finishes in Chamonix and then goes 100 miles around Mont Blanc. What route could you envision? I mean, if you would start in Ashford and then run the Wonderland and come back to Ashford, you would be at a whole lot more miles than just 100.
Yeah. And a lot of miles that wouldn't necessarily be that great.
Exactly. No, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what I'm curious in experiencing. A friend of mine is doing UTMB this summer too, and I think they are probably a lot more in-town road miles than we actually think of these races, because some of these aid stations are right in town. So at some point you have to get off the trails, right? But I think the towns are just so much closer to the actual trails than they are over here. I mean, it's impossible really to run from Olympia to the Capitol Forest. And the Capitol Forest is literally right outside. There are too many roads, too many big roads. There's no trailhead that gives you direct access as a pedestrian. Everything is built around the idea that you pop yourself into the car and you drive for 20 minutes to a trailhead.
Yeah, I guess one example I'm interested to see if it sort of catches on would be that Cocodona race that Aravaipa organized down in Arizona. I'm not super familiar with the course, but my understanding is that it really does link up this series of towns, and that, whether that becomes something where, people are crewing these runners and the crews are stopping in the towns to make purchases or to go to the gas station or get a burger from the restaurant or something like that. And if these, I think part of the vision for Cocodona, my understanding was that, these towns would be proud of being on this race course, and they would, when the race comes through, that people would be happy to see racers, and that it would build some of that sort of economic support for the towns and some excitement around the race among people who live there. And, obviously they did it for the first time. So who knows how that really happened for the first time, but does that kind of a thing really build? And that, here in Washington, so much of our good terrain is in wilderness or maybe far away from towns, but that, are there places where that can happen? Are there ways that can happen? I think that would be interesting to see.
Oh, 100%, right? I mean, if there would be a running trail from downtown Leavenworth, and even though the enchantments are already overrun, so probably we don't need to create an additional incentive to get out there. But on the other side, we could avoid all driving to the trailheads, which are way overcrowded, right? I mean, if there would be a reasonable running trail, because the drive from downtown Leavenworth to the Snow Lake trailhead isn't that far. You could easily run that if there would be a proper trail, right?
Yeah. Well, the Icicle Ridge Trail comes pretty much right out of Leavenworth, and you can do Icicle Ridge along and over to like Grindstone, and then it ends up, or not all the way to Grindstone, but then to 4th of July. And then you end up making like a 40-something mile loop or something if you do like Icicle Ridge and the enchantments together, and it pretty much ends and finishes in Leavenworth.
Oh my gosh, you got to send me that route. That sounds fantastic. Yeah, I didn't know. I guess Icicle Ridge is true. That one starts right in town. I didn't know that from there you can connect. I guess it makes sense.
I gotta find. I'll find it and send it, because but that's a rare example. And again, like for the idea of an event, I mean, it goes into wilderness almost instantly.
Yeah, no, exactly. You couldn't do it from an event point of view. But still from an experience point of view. I mean, I think even, we're talking about individual adventures. And, I mean, now bring climate change in and our need for reducing our carbon output. And if we wouldn't have to drive to our trailheads, and we could actually leave and return to town without needing a car. I mean, it would be amazing. And so I think that there is something to be said to sort of connect, I don't know, this last mile from trailhead to popular town. In town, you would have public transportation potentially and stuff. I mean, there's a whole bunch of possibilities of what you can do from an adventure route. I've been toying with the idea of running from Olympia up to Mount Eleanor, and that would be like a 70-mile day, because obviously you have to come back down somewhere, and it would be one way. I'd have to have a car at one of the trailheads up there. But one of the trickiest parts is that route from Hoodsport to Big Creek to the actual trailhead, because it gets really narrow and there's no curb and cars drive fairly fast there, and it would be very unsafe to run on that stretch. And I've looked and I haven't found good trails from Hoodsport up to that Big Creek area. There are spurts, but I haven't seen anything properly connecting.
And I think the bike is a tool that makes some of that more possible, because when you have to cover a lot of those miles, the bike is so much faster. Are you familiar with Justin Simoni?
No.
So Justin is this guy in Boulder, and he is sort of in the same vein of what Anton Krupicka has been doing lately with the sort of biking to places. He's well known as a guy who does not have a car and does a lot of really huge adventures in Colorado. He did all the 14ers by biking between them, and then he did all the highest 100 biking between them. And he is a really interesting example of how you can sort of use and then Anton also as well, a little bit more famously, but really interesting examples of how you can use the bike to connect these to these adventures. And I think, they're in kind of a different situation, because it's a lot quicker to get from Rocky Mountain National Park, to Boulder by bike than it is to get from, it's the kind of thing where I think they leave at, 2 a.m. or something like that on the bike, and then they're back, that they're at the park in a couple hours or something like that. Whereas, if you wanted to ride your bike from Olympia to Paradise, that's that's not a short bike ride. Yeah. And that's assuming you're going to Paradise, not to the North Cascades or something like that. But I think it's an interesting example, and it does seem like more and more people are doing that kind of a thing. There was a woman last summer, Jen Petrit, who rode her bike from Seattle to Glacier Peak, 100 miles, did Glacier Peak in a single push, then rode her bike back. And that is so awesome to me. Yeah. I think that is so interesting and inspiring. And it gets me, our distances are big. You maybe have to ride your bike 100 miles like she did, but are there these opportunities to make this kind of thing happen? And it's not everywhere, but, and maybe you still have to, I thought about doing something at Snoqualmie Pass. I'm like, okay, I'll drive to Rattlesnake Lake. I'll ride my bike up the Iron Horse Trail to Snoqualmie Pass, and then I'll do my run and then ride my bike back. So it's like, I'm not biking all the way there, but I'm doing it at least half the way there. And so that's a little bit better than it's cutting down on the driving somewhat and making it a little bit more interesting. But I think that that's sort of one of the next level things that folks are exploring right now that sound really interesting. And stuff like, the idea of running from Olympia to Eleanor, I think that sounds pretty cool. I mean, there would probably be a lot of not so fun miles along the way, but that is also the kind of thing that you see that on the map and you're like, wow, that looks cool.
Yes, it's been one of those things that I mapped it out once and I was like, it's totally doable mileage. It's doable in the sense that if you only do it one way, right? You have to come back down and have to have a car on the other side. You're not going to run it back. But I think with the bike, it would be more than doable. And then it's you need a bike for that. But these days, nobody can buy a bike because bikes are back order due to supply chain shortages. So you've been talking about these group orienteering events. Let's wrap this up by talking a little bit about your experience in the post-COVID world. Did you feel comfortable mingling? How is it meeting with other people?
I think as long as things are happening outdoors, it feels okay for me at least. I feel pretty safe in general, although, that I expect will sort of change in the fall as, it looks like we could be on a bad trajectory in some other states and that could happen in Washington here. But, my sense is that as long as people are doing stuff outside, that's probably pretty safe in general. And so, I didn't have really any concerns about, interacting with the volunteers or seeing other people out on the run. I think, there was some time last year where people were running on trails with the mask on and stuff like that for a lot of last year. And then I think people have sort of figured out we probably don't need to do that quite so much. And that certainly makes it feel a lot better. Mm-hmm. And, we'll see where things end up happening right now. But at least for now, it felt safe and it felt good to be just sort of, it's so cliche at this point to say, but it just felt good to feel kind of back to normal for a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel the same way. And we went through an interesting phase where we adjusted our lives so much that we sometimes jokingly said, how can we ever feel comfortable? And then you have a couple experiences with people who you don't have to wear a mask and you're outside and you sort of are with people that you sort of can trust, and you realize how quickly you forget in a positive way and you fall back into this, oh yeah, we are humans again. I mean, I still don't want to hug everyone I see, but it does sort of feel good. Well, good to hear. So lastly, summer is still young. What's on the docket for you for the rest of the summer?
I'm trying to play it by ear a little bit. We'll see what ends up happening with, does smoke get bad? Does smoke not get too bad for a while? At some point it surely will. But, I guess this is sort of a bigger picture thing, but like last year, I went into last year with like a big list of goals. I'm going to do all these things and I'm going to be such an awesome runner and climber and badass. And, of course, most of those I did not achieve, and it was a disaster of a year. And then I felt really bad because I was like, man, I had this huge list of goals and I accomplished almost none of them. And it just like, it was not really a healthy, I feel like I leaned in a little too hard on the goals kind of thing, and it ended up putting me in an unhealthy mental place. And so for this year, my goal is just to have fun and be healthy, and do cool stuff. And so I'm not like committed to specific things that I want to do. And we'll just sort of see. I've got a list of runs I'm looking at. I'd like to potentially do a couple more sort of 50K type runs. If I could do maybe 2 or 3 more unsupported 50K adventure run kind of things, I'd like to do that. I've got, but, I am not trying to stay that committed to any specific things. I just want to go out and have fun. And that's how I'm trying to. And then, maybe next year I'll be back to that sort of more goal-oriented mindset. But that for now, at least, I'm trying to. I'm just not there. How about you?
I think that's you're making a good point, though. That goals are. I think it's good to have dreams, but they also become very harsh mistresses. Is that the term? I don't know. No, it is difficult because if you set yourself goals and you train for it, and even if you don't fully commit by putting race entry money down and book a hotel, right? I mean, I think there is sort of that monetary loss if you get injured beforehand or you DNF or so, right? Where you perhaps mourn a little bit more than if you had something planned this weekend and then got rained out or so, right? But I think it's an interesting balance to strike, to dream and have these things that you want to do, but then and allow yourself to be flexible, right? Because our world in some respects is demanding enough. And if we beat ourselves up because we still didn't stand on that mountain and we've been eyeing it for years or so, then we're doing it for the wrong reasons, right? I think it's good to have these goals to push ourselves and to feel alive, but it's not good when they drag us down and wear us down.
Yeah, well, and I think there's been a lot of talk sort of in some of the trail running goal setting community about, the importance of process goals as opposed to outcome goals. And that, I think that is important, and that the idea of, it's more important to me that I organize my running around things like I want to enjoy running. I want to run, 4 or 5 days a week, every week, as many weeks as possible or something. I want to, stay healthy and make that more, because if I run 5 days a week, every week, and I don't get injured, I'll accomplish cool things. Like that process leads to accomplishing cool things, regardless of whether I have, the mega run on my calendar that I really want to do sometime. At the same time, like ultimately, if you want to do something really big, you have to make that a focus. And, I think it's very difficult to be just a person who, I just go for a run once in a while and I try to have fun. And then and now I'm going to do some Burley 100-miler or something like that. Like if you want to complete the Burley goal, you have to be a little bit more focused on that specific outcome and get ready for that specifically. But just in general, I think for a lifestyle kind of thing, that more process-oriented kind of thing is important and valuable. And so that's how I'm trying to approach it this year. I'm trying to have that healthy mental state, that healthy relationship with running. And then maybe next year I'll come up with some really burly, scary thing that I will.
Maybe next year I'll get unhealthy again.
Yeah, maybe next year I'll be unhealthy again. I don't know, but you're the one with the burly, scary goal. I mean, you're the one who's got to do this Monte Rosa run. So I mean, I think I appreciate what you're doing with some of these, stretching yourself with these longer and more difficult events. Zion earlier in the year, doing what seemed to have been kind of an off the cuff 100K, and then what will be a challenging big European mountain run. I mean, those are the kind of things that I think are big goals that take a lot of focus, and I think you should be proud of what you've done, but that also will require a higher level of focus, I think, than just going out and doing the Loowit Trail.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been dreaming about doing a race in Europe since I've started running. I said right off the bat, once I learned about that you could run on trails and there are races and there are big races, I was always, and I'm European. I run. I used to grow up in the Alps. We as teenagers, when we went hiking in the Alps, we always ran down the mountains. So I'm familiar with the Alps. That's my terrain that I want to, where I want to spend time in. And so for me, it's a huge goal that I'm fulfilling, a huge dream that I'm fulfilling for myself, is to be able to go and stand at a start line of a European race. And, friend of the show, Scott's making fun of me by using the term terrifying. These big races are absolutely terrifying for me. You can't train for them in a way that you do them regularly these distances regularly, that it becomes second nature, something that you sort of incrementally puzzle piece by piece have to put together in the hope that on race day everything works. At Zion it didn't, at Lumberjack it did. And so I'm practically super excited because they have to reroute the course for Monte Rosa because they have a hard time getting the permitting and starting in Italy and then crossing a border during COVID times. And so they're doing a complete different route than they normally do. And by the end of this week, they are going to be announcing that. So I'm sort of on pins and needles trying to figure out what that route's going to be looking like. And I mean, my big hope is that while it's going to be wicked hard, I hope that I'm going to be running through a terrain that will feel so incredibly unique and special and at the same time nostalgic for me. Mm-hmm. That is what will carry me.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if, we started this whole thing by talking a little bit about some of the unusual terrain that is different than sort of the classic Pacific Northwest that we're used to, and that, both the Loowit to a lesser degree, but that more so Zion are examples of that. And that, if you are in sort of if you are in this terrain that really speaks to you, that you have this relationship with, that might give you a boost that you didn't necessarily, whether it's like the actual familiarity in terms of I'm used to this terrain, I know what this is like, and then also just sort of the mental and emotional boost. I think that'll certainly make a difference. But yeah, I mean, any way you slice it, I mean, that route has many, many, many thousands of feet of elevation gain. So it's going to be work.
It's going to be hard, and it's going to be hard because the cutoff is really tight. So I worry. That's, I think, my biggest worry is that I'm just not going to be able to make cutoff. So right after this podcast, I'm going to go back out and do some hammering of some vertical hills in order to prepare myself as best as I can for it. So no, I hope that I'm just going to be floating the entire way because it's just going to be so amazing to be running in Switzerland in the shadow of Matterhorn and Monte Rosa. And I mean, Piz Gloria above Schlitthorn. I'm literally going to be running right underneath the Schlitthorn, which is a 4,000 meter peak, I think close to 4,000 meter peak, which it has Piz Gloria on top, which is this revolving restaurant, which is used in one of my favorite and craziest James Bonds, On Your Majesty's Secret Service.
Oh, yeah.
And I love, for me, my favorite James Bonds are all the ones that have these crazy scenes in the Alps, all these skiing and ski jumping and luge tracking, all those crazy scenes. And so, you know, I mean, just knowing this alone will sort of make me like jump up these mountains. No big deal.
We could do another hour right now on James Bond, I think, but we'll spare the listeners from that.
No, we won't spare them. We tease them and postpone it, and get back to it.
Yeah, it sounds like an awesome course, and I looked at some of the pictures, and it's like, wow, that does look like a really cool place to run.
I'm curious from a practical piece too, right? I mean, grass is green on the other side. It's going to be interesting to see. I've been over here now for over 20 years, and Europe is nostalgic, but perhaps it's not all that what it's cracked up to be. Perhaps I've become more West Coast than I want to admit, and I'll be coming back and saying, well, it was really good, but having constantly these cowbells in my face and, what they're serving at aid stations and some of the organization or whatever, right? I mean, it could be that I'm coming back and like, actually, I've turned into a grungy Pacific Northwesterner without realizing, and I like it over here more. I don't know, right? I am expecting a part of that to be that too. We'll see. Or I'm come back and saying, that's it, people. I am moving. Kids, get packing.
Well, I'm sure I'm interested to hear about how the preparation goes, and then of course I'm sure the race story is going to be a good one. We're all looking forward to that.
Absolutely. Well, Alex, thank you so much for jumping in and being on the show. Much appreciated. Why don't you tell our listeners one more time where they can follow your adventures, if you want them to, and if you have any links to share or anything.
Yeah, I'm on Strava, Alex Bond. I'm on my Instagram account is nothing special. It's Alex J, spelled Jay Bond on Instagram. What I do have to give a shout out to though is I'm an ambassador now for Athletic Brewing, and so this is actually a cool thing. You know, part of what had me down in the dumps last year was my relationship with alcohol. You know, that was not working for me, and so part of how I've been able to have sort of this transformation and be in a healthier place this year is by changing my relationship with alcohol. And Athletic Brewing, they make non-alcoholic beer that actually tastes good, which until recently did not really exist. And having this as an option, it really helped me turn things around. I lost weight, I improved my running, I'm sleeping better, I'm happier. It's just really fantastic. And so I encourage people to check out Athletic. You know, it seems like almost everybody under the sun is an athletic ambassador nowadays, maybe, but I do encourage folks to check it out. There's discount code ABOND20 if you want to try it out. It actually is non-alcoholic beer that tastes good, and that's kind of the pitch, and it worked on me. I really liked it. If folks have questions, there's information out there, but I want to give a shout out to them because they made, their product actually made a lot of what I'm doing now possible in a way. And so I'm psyched about that. But other than that, I'm involved with the Seattle Running Club for folks who are in the Seattle area. We're starting to organize some group runs again. And so, reach out to group runs at seattlerunningclub.org if you're interested in learning more about that. And then, I'm still helping out the Fastest Known Time website folks with their submissions there. And then, for people who enjoyed the talk about orienteering, Cascade Orienteering Club is the Washington State organization. It's cascadeoc.org. And then if you live in another state, there are a bunch of other orienteering clubs all over. You can Google it, and I'm sure you'll find them.
Fantastic. Links to all of that is in the show notes, and his name is Alex Bond.